Welcome to the audio version of Tales of the Axe by Ross P. Suni. Woman in White. Did I ever tell you the time when I met this woman? The grandfather asked his two grandsons. They looked up at him as they sat on the floor with their Tonka trucks. They watched him rock back and forth in his favorite rocking chair. He continued his story before they even had a chance to answer. You see, I just turned 16, and a friend of mine, Paul Masters, surprised me with a little birthday party. We met in the middle of town one day, and he said to me, "Roy, my dad and I are putting in a well behind our house, and we just wanted to know if we can borrow your father's pitchfork." I knew that the back of Paul's house was very wooded, so I knew my father wouldn't mind. Plus, I have never seen Paul work a day in his life. This should be fun to watch. Paul gave me a time of 10 o'clock that night to drop off the pitchfork. I thought this was strange at first, unless they were going to start early the next morning and wanted to make sure that they had all the equipment. It took me a good 45 minutes to walk from my house to his. When I got to the front of his house, I knocked hard against the solid oak door. No answer. I tried again, and to my surprise, a man that I have never seen before answered. This man was big. He was so big that I didn't think he was a man. I think he was really a bear in man's clothing. The grandfather looked down at the two young boys to see if they understood the comparison. By their blank expressions, they didn't seem to. Anyway, the huge man didn't talk much, so I spoke up first and asked if he knew where Paul was. The man looked down at the pitchfork that I held in my hand, then back at me. He asked me if my name was Roy. When I answered yes, he told me that Paul indeed was expecting me, but not here. He wanted me to meet him at the Big White Cabin. Although I heard of this cabin, I had never been there. What I did know is that it was deep in the woods, past the old cemetery. I heard many stories about that cabin, the kind that would keep you up all night. I didn't tell the huge man that I heard these stories. I didn't want him to think I was scared. But I did ask him how I should get there. The huge man cleared his throat and started to give me directions. "Follow the dirt path that leads into the woods," the man said. "That path will take you to the cemetery. Keep walking until you come to a crooked cross. The cross leans to the right. That's the direction you want to go in. Keep walking until you come to a clearing. Now, in the middle of that clearing, you'll see the Big White Cabin. Can't miss it." Before I could be on my way, the huge man stopped me with his words. "You don't need that," he said as he pointed to my father's pitchfork. "Leave that here. It's for your own safety." So I left the pitchfork with the man and headed into the woods. During my journey, I started to think about the stories I had heard. People used to say that the White Cabin was built back in the early 1800s. They said a man built the place for himself and his daughter, while others say that it wasn't his daughter, but his mistress. The daughter just happened to catch the two of them together, and he dragged her into the cemetery and buried her alive. The grandfather noticed that the children were starting to pay more attention to him. He cleared his throat, reached over to the table next to him, picked up his favorite pipe, clutched it between his teeth, and lit the tobacco. The smooth vanilla aroma escaped his mouth and hovered around the room. I didn't know what stories to believe, but I did know that the cabin existed, and I believed Paul was there, waiting for me. I walked about 2 miles before reaching the cemetery. I had only seen this place in the daytime, and even then it looked scary to me. The headstones were old and giving away. The tall grass and trees densely covered the entrance as if to keep visitors like me out. The wind pushed me closer to the cemetery, but before I entered, I took control of my fears and told myself not to be afraid. When I stepped into the realm of the rested, I told myself to look straight at all times, not to let shadows or noises distract me. Slowly I walked as the light of the moon guided me through the maze of tombstones. All I could hear was the wind rustling through the trees and the long dried grass as it brushed across my legs. Before long I saw the crooked cross in my view. I turned right and made my way through the overgrown bushes until I came to a clearing. In front of me stood the White Cabin. I heard voices and laughter coming from the inside. I opened the door to see Paul and the rest of my friends. They were dancing and having a delightful time. "Roy," Paul shouted, "you have arrived." Everyone cheered and wished me a happy birthday. I realized that this was all for me. My friends lifted me in their arms and carried me around the room for all to see. I danced with some lovely maidens and joked with my fellow neighbors. I even had a pie-eating contest with my best friend Paul. He won. We partied late into the night. I had a feeling it was past my curfew and needed to get home. I said goodbye to Paul and my friends and left the big white cabin. When I started to walk back home, I gave myself the same rule as before. Look straight at all times, not to let shadows or noises distract me. But, like in life, there are too many distractions before you can reach your goal. For me, it was the noise of a soft cry. A woman's cry of sorrow is what I heard, and I decided to find out what was wrong. I stepped off the trail and went deeper into the cemetery. I came upon a small clearing, and there in the middle stood a white marble bench. She was sitting there with her head buried in her hands, weeping. As I walked closer, I noticed she was wearing a long white gown. It looked like it was once beautiful, but now it was torn and coated with mud. I was just about to ask her what was wrong when she looked up at me. "Don't touch me!" she shouted in a deep southern accent. I jumped back and then tried to calm her down. I felt it would take some time for her to trust me. She seemed very nervous. I promised her that I would not touch her. I just wanted to know why she was crying. She started telling me about a man who would come home drunk and then slap her or touch her, depending on the mood he was in. She said it would drive her crazy. It drove me crazy just listening to her story. The part that hurt me the most was that she didn't look any older than 14 years of age. The wind howled across our faces as she told me that she wanted to poison him, but never found the courage to go through with it. I told her I would have. Her blue, tearing eyes looked into mine. "You would murder your own father?" she asked. I felt faint at that moment and sat down next to her. She jumped up quickly and warned me again not to touch her. I wanted to apologize but found myself speechless. She sat back down and continued her story. "Yes, it was my father," she said. "My mother died when I was only 7. My father was never the same after that. We moved deep into the woods and he built us a home. But he was never there. He was always at the pub drinking himself crazy." I broke into his workroom. She started to cry at the same time. I took his axe. I told myself if he touched me one more time, I would have no choice but to use it. I hid behind his favorite rocking chair and waited for him to come home. I'd almost fallen asleep when he finally returned. My body felt numb, and the axe started to feel heavier in my hands. He was looking for me as I heard him call out my name. By the tone of his voice, I knew why he wanted me. "Cassia," he would say, "where's my beautiful girl?" That's the only time he would call me beautiful. I hated him for that. She wiped her tears away, then looked up into the darkened sky and continued her words of sadness. "I wish it didn't happen. I thought I could hold it, but the axe slipped out of my hand and hit the floor. He came over to me. I had to think quickly. I picked up the axe and jumped out from behind his chair. My legs became weak from sitting on the floor too long. I stumbled and fell. He tried to catch me. I know he did. The axe hit the floor first, and then I landed on top. The blade of the axe went through my rib cage." She opened up her white gown and showed me the long scar which laid across her chest and heart. A cold chill ran down the back of my neck. I felt so bad for her that I did the one thing that she asked me not to do. I touched her. It was on her shoulder. She turned to me and gave me a disappointed look. She stood up and walked away from me. I hurried up after her, but she vanished into the mist. I felt numb and asked myself if this had just happened. I walked back to the path and found myself in front of the crooked cross. The moonlight above shined onto the engraved letters that spelled out these words: "Here lies my beautiful daughter, Cassia Rose Lamel. Always will be missed, but never forgotten."